The secret his father kept trapped him in the past, until a stranger reappeared and changed everything. Henry lives in silence, cut off from the world, trapped in a past that eats away at him. The town knows him as a cold man, but few understand the secret that holds him captive. When Emily arrives, with her unexpected presence and determined gaze, she brings a light Henry didn't know he needed. But the past doesn't stay buried for long. There was something in Henry's eyes that the people of the small town could never quite decipher. The man, now 30 years old, was a solitary and enigmatic figure. His gaze, always distant, seemed to carry an invisible pain, a burden no one else knew. As a young boy, Henry had been seen as cheerful and full of life. He used to be the pride of his father, Thomas, a local merchant and owner of the hardware store downtown. But now, any trace of that smiling boy had disappeared, replaced by the shadow of who he used to be. The townspeople noticed the change, but no one knew for sure what had caused it. It must be because of his father's death, some whispered. Others believed he had simply grown cold over time. What no one could have imagined was that Henry's transformation was tied to a terrible secret, something he bore alone, which slowly eroded his soul. 20 years ago, a tragedy changed his life forever. On that rainy night, 10-year-old Henry was awakened by the sound of the front door slamming. He rushed down the stairs and found his father, Thomas, sitting at the kitchen table, his hands covering his face. The air was thick, heavy. Thomas was drenched to the bone, his breath uneven, almost gasping. Henry approached, worried. "Dad? What happened?" the boy asked hesitantly. Thomas lifted his eyes, and Henry never forgot what he saw, a mix of despair, guilt, and fear. In that moment, something changed between the two of them. That night, Thomas had caused an accident that claimed the lives of an entire family, a father, a mother, and an 8-year-old girl. He had survived, but the guilt and fear of being found out haunted him. The accident was declared to have been caused by heavy rain and poor road conditions, and no one ever knew Thomas had been involved. But Henry knew. A few days before his death, Thomas had confessed everything to his son in a desperate attempt at redemption. He made Henry promise to never tell anyone. That promise, made by a 10-year-old boy, became an invisible chain that still imprisoned Henry to this day. From that day on, Henry's relationship with his father changed forever. He could no longer look at Thomas the same way. The respect and admiration he once had disintegrated. Though Thomas died years later, Henry inherited not only the hardware store, but also the burden of carrying his father's guilt. Now, decades after the tragedy, Henry lived a lifeless existence. He spent his days in the store, performing the same monotonous tasks, arranging shelves, selling tools, nails, screws. But everything was done on autopilot. His interactions with customers were brief and emotionless. No one knew the weight he carried, and he made sure to keep his distance. When someone got too close, Henry would retreat, raising a wall of coldness and silence. "Good morning, Henry. How are you today?" A regular customer, Mr. Miller, greeted cheerfully as he entered the store. Henry reflexively looked up and nodded. "Everything's fine, Mr. Miller. Do you need anything?" he responded practically, without raising his voice or showing interest. Mr. Miller was one of the few who still tried to maintain some form of friendliness with Henry, but even he could feel the coldness in the air. It didn't take long for all dialogues to become short and impersonal. Henry moved through the world like a shadow, physically present but emotionally absent. What no one knew was that in every distant gaze, he saw himself back on that night, on the dark, wet road where a family's life was taken, and with it, part of his own. At night, when the town fell silent and the lights went out, Henry stayed awake. He rarely managed to sleep for more than a few hours. The dreams were always the same: the car skidding on the road, muffled screams, the final silence. When he woke up, his body was tense, and sweat dripped from his forehead, as if he were reliving the moment each time. Sometimes, he would stand on the porch of the house he had inherited from his father, staring into the darkness, trying to find some meaning in it all. He avoided driving down the road where the accident had occurred, but he couldn't escape the memory. The silent burden he carried made him an exile in his own life, a man who no longer knew what it meant to live. For years, he had tried to find a way to free himself, but the guilt, the promise he made to his father, held him captive. Deep down, Henry felt that his life had ended that night. He had become a prisoner of his own silence, unable to share his torment with anyone. Sometimes, in the solitude of the early hours, he wondered if it would ever be possible to find some kind of peace. But what he didn't know was that his life was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. The past he had tried so hard to bury was beginning to resurface. And this time, he wouldn't be able to escape. It was a cold winter morning, and the sharp wind made the windows of Henry's hardware store rattle. As usual, he had arrived early, even before the sun rose. There was something about the solitude of the early hours that calmed him, a silent peace before the world woke up. He was organizing the shelves, an activity he did with mechanical precision, when he heard the sound of the door chimes jingling. He lifted his head, surprised, as he rarely had customers this early. At the entrance stood a woman with a determined expression, pausing for a moment to brush the snowflakes off her coat. She looked about Henry's age, her eyes firm and curious, but there was something more, an intensity he couldn't decipher. "Excuse me," said the woman, her voice soft but with a confidence that caught him off guard. "Are you in need of help around the store?" Henry, unaccustomed to spontaneous interactions, observed her for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She was direct, no beating around the bush. He blinked, trying to process the situation. Up until that moment, he had never considered hiring anyone to help at the store. The work was his only way to stay occupied, immersed in a routine that kept him from thinking too much. I've never hired anyone," he said, his words coming out a bit hesitant. "I don't usually need help." The woman didn't seem fazed by his response. On the contrary, her slight smile suggested she had anticipated his reaction. "I understand," she said, stepping forward with a relaxed but firm posture. "But maybe it wouldn't hurt to have someone around. You never know when you might need an extra hand." Henry frowned, feeling uncomfortable. It wasn't just the unexpected offer that bothered him, but the way she looked at him, as if she could see beyond the cold and distant facade. No one did that. The townspeople avoided direct contact, preferring to keep their distance. "I'm Emily, by the way," she continued, extending her hand. "I'm not from around here, but I've been in town for a while and I'm looking for work. If you're willing to try it, I can start whenever you need." Henry looked at Emily's outstretched hand, hesitating before shaking it quickly. His mind was spinning. He didn't know why, but something about her made him consider the offer, even though it went against everything he usually did. Maybe it was the weariness of his own loneliness, or perhaps a part of him, buried deep inside, was seeking something he didn't even recognize. "Okay, you can start tomorrow," he said, somewhat surprised by his own response. He almost expected her to back out, to give up on the idea. However, she smiled, as if she had already known he would say yes. "Perfect," Emily replied. "I'll be here in the morning." "Thank you." With a final smile, she turned and left the store, the sound of the chimes echoing once more in the air. Henry stood still for a moment, staring at the door, trying to understand what had just happened. He had never planned on hiring an employee. In fact, he avoided any kind of closeness with people, especially someone as direct as Emily. Yet, for some reason, he couldn't refuse. That night, at home, while staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, Henry wondered why he had agreed. He couldn't remember the last time someone had entered his life so unexpectedly. And, even though he tried to ignore the feeling, he knew that something was different. There was a restlessness in his chest, a strange curiosity about the woman he barely knew. Why would someone choose to work in his store, especially not knowing the town well? And why, of all people, had he, who always kept to himself, accepted her so quickly? The next day, Emily arrived promptly as promised. Henry was already there, as usual, trying to act naturally, but he felt strange thinking that someone else would now share his workspace. He watched her enter the store, her thick coat still covered in snow, and greeted her with a simple nod. "Ready to start?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes, sir," she replied with a smile, which made him quickly look away. Emily began working with an efficiency that impressed him. She organized the shelves with precision, cleaned the counter, and even offered to help customers. With each task she completed, Henry watched her from a distance, still wondering why she had chosen that small store. It wasn't just the fact that she had come looking for a job. There was something deeper, something he sensed but couldn't name. Over the days, Henry began to notice that Emily's presence was, in a way, changing the rhythm of the store. The customers, who used to barely exchange words with him, seemed more at ease with Emily. She had a knack for dealing with people that he never had. She listened to the customers attentively, asked questions about what they needed, and eventually even engaged in casual conversations. "How do you do that?" Henry asked in a rare moment of curiosity after watching Emily chat casually with a customer. She laughed, shaking her head. "Do what?" "Talk to people, in a way that makes it seem so easy." Emily shrugged. "I guess it's something I've always done. I like hearing people's stories. Besides, everyone has something to say, they just need someone who cares enough to listen." Henry didn't respond, but those words echoed in his mind. For so long, he had avoided any meaningful interaction, isolating himself behind the counter and the store's shelves. Now, for the first time in years, he felt a spark of curiosity, not just about others, but about the woman who, in some way, challenged him to see the world differently. However, what Henry didn't know was that Emily carried her own scars as well. And while she rearranged shelves and chatted with customers, she was hiding a secret that was about to change everything. That night, after another long day of work at the store, Henry felt an unexpected urge. Perhaps it was the overwhelming silence, or maybe it was Emily's constant presence that stirred something within him he didn't fully understand. He wasn't one to initiate social interactions, but something made him act differently that night. As he closed up the store, he looked at Emily, who was gathering the last tools from the shelf. "Would you like to have dinner with me tonight?" Henry asked, his voice wavering slightly as if testing the words. Emily paused in what she was doing, surprised by the invitation. Up until that point, Henry had never shown any interest in sharing anything outside the store environment. She noticed a certain hesitation in his eyes, as if he were taking a big step outside his comfort zone. "Sure, why not?" she responded with a slight smile. Henry felt both relieved and more nervous. They chose a simple restaurant in town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. The atmosphere was cozy, but even so, Henry felt a slight tension in the air. He wasn't used to sharing a meal with someone, especially with someone like Emily, who seemed to see through his layers. During dinner, the conversation started simple. They talked about the store, the flow of customers, and the increasingly harsh winter. Henry remained attentive but distant, as if avoiding a deeper topic. He felt there was something unsaid between them, a kind of shadow hanging over the dinner. "The town seems quiet, but I imagine it hasn't always been like that for you," Emily suddenly commented, shifting the tone of the conversation. She was staring at him with those eyes that always seemed deeper than Henry was willing to admit. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to sound casual but feeling his discomfort grow. Emily, however, didn't look away. "I mean, we all have a past, Henry. And as much as you try to keep everything in silence, I know there's something you haven't shared. Something you carry with you every day." Henry remained silent. Her words hit him like a punch in the gut. How could she know? No one knew. He had kept his father's secret for years, never mentioning the weight he carried to anyone. He looked away, trying to keep his composure, but he felt the pressure building. The air in the restaurant seemed to grow denser. "I don't understand. What are you talking about?" Henry tried to deflect, but his voice faltered slightly. Emily sighed, as if preparing herself for something she knew would be difficult. "I know about the accident," she said, lowering her voice to a near gentle but firm tone. "I know what happened that night." Henry froze. His mind refused to accept what he had just heard. He felt his whole body tense, his sweaty hands gripping the glass of water. How could she know? No one but him and his father knew about the accident. No one. It was a secret he had buried so deep that it almost didn't seem real. But now, sitting in front of her, the past was coming back with overwhelming force. How do you know? Henry asked, his voice now low, almost a whisper. Emily took a deep breath, and for a moment, her eyes seemed to shine with a sadness Henry couldn't decipher. I was the little girl in the car, she said, her voice calm but with such heavy emotional weight that the air seemed to stop around them. Henry felt as if the world had shattered at that moment. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. It was as if every wall he had built over the years was collapsing all at once. The little girl in the car. The only survivor of the accident he believed had taken the lives of an entire family. She was there, sitting in front of him, alive after all these years. I thought everyone had died, Henry stammered, his voice weak. His eyes were fixed on Emily, but his mind seemed incapable of fully processing what she had just revealed. Emily watched him, her expression calm but full of compassion. I almost did die, she replied, her voice a bit softer. I was taken to a hospital in another town right after the accident. There was no one to tell the story. My closest relatives were far away, and by the time I was finally discharged from the hospital, it was too late to do anything. Henry ran his hand over his face, trying to control his breathing. He had never imagined that anyone had survived. For years, the guilt consumed him. He grew up believing that his father had taken 3 lives that night, and now, knowing that Emily, the woman he had hired, was the survivor, it was something he simply didn't know how to handle. Why didn't you say anything before? Henry asked, his voice trembling. There was a mix of confusion, pain, and even fear in his eyes. He was unraveling inside, unable to understand how she had managed to stay silent until now. Emily sighed, and this time there was a slight hesitation in her response. At first, I didn't know you were Thomas's son, but after I started working at the store, people in town talked about you, about your father. That's how I found out. And then, I wanted to see for myself. I wanted to understand who you were. If you were like him. Henry looked away, her words hitting hard. He didn't know how to respond. The image of his father, his responsibility, everything that happened that night, was all swirling in his mind. The memories were coming back, now more vivid than ever. I'm so sorry, he murmured, his voice choked by the guilt consuming him. I don't know how to apologize for all of this. I should have done something. I should have told the truth. Emily reached out and touched his hand gently, which made Henry look at her. There was an unexpected tenderness in her touch, something he hadn't expected to feel. You're not your father, Henry, she said, her eyes filled with compassion. And you're not to blame for what happened. You were just a child. You can't carry this burden alone. Henry remained silent. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the pain without trying to push it away. Tears threatened to fill his eyes, but he held them back. Everything he knew, everything he believed about that night was now in question. Emily was there, alive, and somehow she forgave him. But Henry didn't know if he could forgive himself. Emily's words echoed in Henry's mind, as if time had stopped the moment she revealed her true identity. He watched her, but it was as though he was looking through her, unable to fully absorb what he had just heard. The woman who, somehow, had brought a glimmer of light into his dark life was also the ghost from his past. The little girl he thought had died in the accident caused by his father was sitting right there, alive, in front of him. I didn't know, Henry stammered, trying to organize his thoughts amidst the chaos forming in his mind. I had no idea anyone survived. Emily kept her eyes fixed on him, her calm expression contrasting with the storm raging inside Henry. I know you didn't know, she replied, her voice firm but gentle. And that's why I'm here, Henry. I'm not here to accuse you or blame you for what happened. I came because I wanted to understand. Henry looked away, unable to hold the intensity of the moment. He felt the crushing weight of the guilt that had haunted him since he learned about the accident. He had carried that burden alone for so many years, and now, confronted with the truth, He didn't know what to do. I always thought that, Henry began, but his voice faltered, and he had to take a deep breath to continue. I always believed that my father had killed all of you, that I was carrying the guilt for that. I could never forgive myself for not doing anything, for keeping this secret. Emily reached out again, touching Henry's arm with a delicate yet significant gesture. Her touch brought him back to reality, as if she was trying to anchor him in the moment, so he wouldn't get lost in the whirlwind of emotions consuming him. You were just a child, Henry, she said softly. There was nothing you could have done back then. It's not fair for you to have carried this burden alone for all these years. Henry shook his head, his eyes fixed on the table as though he was trying to find the right words to express what he was feeling. But how could he explain the guilt, the pain, and the emptiness that had accompanied him every day? How could he describe what it felt like to live as a shadow of himself, tormented by a secret that wasn't his to bear? I tried to live with it, he whispered, his voice heavy with sadness. I tried to bury the past, to forget, but I never could. Every day, I wake up feeling like I'm drowning. The guilt consumed me in ways I didn't know how to handle. Emily watched him closely, sensing the weight of each word. She could see the pain he tried to hide, the burden that had shaped him over the years. Henry was a man who had lived in emotional exile, cut off from the world and from himself, because of a secret he should never have had to carry. It's not your fault, Emily said, her voice firm but full of compassion. Your father was responsible for what happened, but you are not him, Henry, and you weren't there. It's not fair that you've suffered so much for something that wasn't your fault. Henry finally looked her in the eyes, and for a moment, the weight of his emotions felt unbearable. He felt the tears welling up, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The walls he had built were crumbling, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel everything he had kept buried for so long. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry for everything. Emily gave a soft, sad smile, full of understanding. I'm sorry too, Henry, for what happened. But what happened that night was an accident. A terrible accident, yes, but no one planned for it to happen. And what I've learned over the years is that we can't change the past. All we can do is try to find a way to live with what remains. Henry felt Emily's words penetrate deep into his heart, but accepting them was still painful. He had spent years punishing himself, believing that somehow he was responsible too. How could he suddenly accept forgiveness? How could he forgive himself? I don't know if I can do that, he admitted, his voice almost imperceptible. I don't know how to let go of this guilt. I've spent so long living with it that I don't know how to be any different. Emily leaned slightly across the table, her eyes locked on his, her expression full of empathy. You don't have to do it alone, Henry. Her words sounded like a promise, and there was an unexpected firmness in her voice. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here because I believe that, despite everything, there's a chance for healing. Not for what happened, but for us. I know it's hard, but you have to allow yourself to feel, to let it out, and eventually to leave the past behind. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, letting Emily's words echo in his mind. Leave the past behind. He had thought about that so many times, but it always seemed impossible. However, now, with Emily there, alive, forgiving him in ways he never could have imagined, something began to change. A small thread of hope started to form, a possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could finally set himself free. I'm not sure I'm ready for that, he said, opening his eyes again and looking at her sincerely. Emily gave him a soft smile, and, without letting go of his hand, she replied calmly, No one's ever really ready, Henry. But sometimes we have to take the first step, even when it feels like we don't have the strength to keep going. Those words struck Henry in a way he hadn't expected. He had always lived defensively, shielding himself from the world, but now he felt that maybe there was a way out, a chance to find some peace. Emily's forgiveness, so unexpected and generous, offered him something he had never considered possible. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Henry looked down at Emily's hand on his, feeling the softness of her touch, but also the strength that radiated from her. For the first time in many years, he felt that maybe he wasn't completely alone. I'll try, he said finally, his voice fragile but filled with sincerity. I don't know if I can, but I'll try. Emily squeezed his hand a little more firmly, and her eyes shone with a mix of relief and hope. That's all I ask, Henry. One step at a time. And in that moment, under the dim lights of the restaurant, something shifted for Henry. It wasn't a complete change, nor an instant cure, but it was a start. He still didn't know if he could forgive himself, but he was willing to try. For the first time in many years, he felt that maybe there was a possibility of redemption, not just for what had happened, but for his own life. The days that followed the dinner were strange for Henry. He found himself awash in a mixture of emotions that he didn't know how to process. The weight of the secret he had carried for so many years was still there, but something had changed. Emily's presence, her forgiveness, her words of understanding, all of it had planted a seed of hope that he couldn't ignore, though he still struggled to believe that it was possible to free himself from the guilt entirely. The next morning after the dinner, Henry arrived at the store as usual, earlier than necessary. The sky was still dark, the winter chill seemed harsher that morning, and yet he felt something different in the air. As he organized the shelves, a ritual he always performed to keep his mind busy, he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before. The conversation with Emily had shaken him deeply, but in a way he couldn't define. When Emily arrived for work, Henry watched her from a distance, as though trying to understand what exactly she now meant to him. She seemed the same as always, greeting him with a soft smile before starting her routine of cleaning and organizing. But for Henry, everything felt different. He wondered what she really thought. Did she see him as the son of the man who had ruined her life? Was there some hidden resentment behind her gentle forgiveness? These thoughts haunted him, even though Emily never showed any sign of bitterness. In fact, with each passing day, Henry realized how essential she had become to the functioning of the store. She had forged a connection with the customers, something he never managed to do. The store was busier than ever, and for the first time in a long while, Henry felt that work wasn't just an escape, but something he was beginning to value again. One afternoon, after they had closed the store, Henry approached Emily as she finished organizing the last of the tools. "Do you have any plans for tonight?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. It was the first time he had initiated a conversation outside of work since the dinner. Emily looked at him in surprise but smiled. "I don't have any plans." "Why?" Henry hesitated for a moment, still getting used to the idea of wanting to spend time with someone. He had grown so accustomed to his solitude that the mere thought of inviting her to something more felt disconcerting. "I was thinking of going for a walk, maybe grabbing some coffee. If you'd like to join me." Emily smiled again, this time more warmly, as if she understood the effort Henry was making. "I'd love to." They left the store together and walked towards the small cafe in town. The snow fell gently, and the cold made both of them stay quiet for a moment, appreciating the tranquility the town provided. Henry felt a strange peace walking beside Emily. For so many years he had avoided any kind of closeness with people, but now, being beside her, he felt that something inside him was slowly thawing, like the ice that covered the streets. When they reached the cafe, they chose a table by the window. While waiting for their orders, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. There was something comforting about simply being in Emily's presence. She made him feel that it was possible to exist without the constant weight of guilt. "Have you been thinking much about what we talked about?" Emily asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Henry looked into her eyes and immediately knew she was referring to the dinner, to the revelation that had changed everything between them. "I've been thinking about it every day," Henry admitted with a sigh. "I still don't know if I fully understand what you said that night. About forgiveness, about moving on. Feels distant, you know? Like something I don't know if I'm capable of." Emily nodded slowly, as though she had expected that response. "I know it's not easy, Henry. I'm not saying you need to change overnight, but the first step is always the hardest. And you've already taken that step. Henry furrowed his brow, feeling confused. And what step is that? Emily smiled softly. You're here. You're trying. You're listening to me. For someone who spent so long carrying this burden alone, that's already a big change. Henry remained silent, reflecting on what she said. He had never thought of it that way. Maybe the simple act of allowing Emily into his life was, in fact, progress. He had built so many barriers over the years that trusting someone, sharing something, was a huge challenge for him. I think I've gotten used to living with the weight, Henry said in a lower voice, as if admitting something for the first time. I don't know who I am without this guilt. Emily leaned in a bit closer, her eyes locked on his. Maybe it's time to find out. What happened with your father, it shaped who you became, I understand that. But you're not just that, Henry. You have the right to be more than the past. Emily's words hit Henry in a way he hadn't expected. For so long, he had believed that the accident defined him, that the secret had turned him into someone incapable of living fully. But now, with Emily sitting across from him, he began to wonder if that was really true. Could he somehow rediscover himself, find a way beyond the guilt? Their coffee arrived, and they continued talking. The cold outside contrasted with the warmth of the conversation unfolding between them. For the first time in a long while, Henry felt a lightness in his soul, something he had never allowed himself to feel. He found himself smiling, and it surprised him. It was a shy, almost imperceptible smile, but it was there. He looked at Emily and realized that, somehow, she was transforming his life, not just by forgiving him, but by showing him that maybe there was more to him than the weight of the past. When they left the cafe, the sky was already dark, but the streetlights illuminated the snow that fell softly. They walked side by side in silence for a few minutes, and Henry felt that, for the first time in years, he was experiencing a kind of peace. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it was a start. Emily stopped suddenly, turning to face him. Henry, I know all of this is hard for you, and I don't expect everything to be resolved at once. But I believe in you. I believe that you're more than what happened. Henry looked at her, feeling a mix of gratitude and admiration. Thank you, Emily. I don't know if I've said this yet, but thank you for being here. She smiled, and her eyes shone with the same hope that Henry was beginning to feel. I'm grateful too, Henry. Very grateful. And with that, they said their goodbyes, knowing that, despite everything, what they had between them was something new, something that could grow and strengthen over time. The past might still haunt them occasionally, but now, they were ready to face it, together. The months that followed were like a new chapter in Henry's life, though he knew the journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. The mornings in the hardware store, once solitary and quiet, were now filled with the soft sound of Emily's voice as she organized stock or helped customers. The flow of the store had changed. People seemed more comfortable, and even Henry, though still quiet and reserved, was starting to show signs of opening up. Henry's daily routine, which had once been an escape from reality, began to transform into something more. He started to engage with customers more naturally, observing how Emily had a gift for making even the briefest conversations seem important. She brought life to the space that, for so long, had felt stagnant. And, slowly, Henry began to realize something he hadn't considered before. Life could be more than just a series of gray, empty days. One spring afternoon, after the snow had finally melted and the streets were clean again, Henry and Emily were closing the store. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was the kind of beauty Henry used to ignore, but now something made him stop and take notice. Beautiful evening, isn't it? Emily remarked as she locked the store's door. Henry, who was adjusting the tools in a wooden box, glanced up at the sky and nodded. Yeah, I guess I never really noticed it before, he admitted with a faint smile. Emily walked over and leaned beside him on the makeshift counter Henry had built by the store entrance. The air was fresh, and there was a sense of renewal all around, as if the world itself was trying to show Henry that change was possible. You've been noticing a lot of things lately, Emily commented, giving him a knowing look. Henry smiled, this time a more genuine smile. He was allowing himself to feel again. It was strange, almost like rediscovering his body and mind after years of emotional numbness. "I think you had something to do with that," Henry said, his voice soft but full of sincerity. "Since you showed up, I've started seeing things differently. I don't know how to explain it, but you've changed everything." Emily looked at him for a moment, and her eyes gleamed with emotion. She knew that those words came from a deep place, and the fact that Henry was finally opening up to her meant more than anything else. "I didn't change you, Henry," she smiled back. "I just helped you remember who you really are. For so long, you've been hiding behind the weight of the past, but the person you are, that person has always been here. You just needed a little push." Henry was silent for a few seconds, absorbing what she said. He knew that, despite all the progress, there were still moments when the past haunted him. Sometimes, he woke up in the middle of the night, sweating and reliving the memories of the accident and his father. But now, when those moments came, he didn't feel as alone. Emily was there, beside him, ready to remind him that he wasn't his father, that he didn't have to carry that guilt forever. "It's still not easy, you know," Henry confessed, his voice low and filled with vulnerability. "Sometimes, I feel like the weight of what happened will never go away." Emily nodded, understanding. She knew that emotional healing wasn't linear, that there would be ups and downs, and that even with all the progress, Henry would still struggle with the shadows of his past. "I know," she replied gently, "but you're taking steps and that's what matters. Don't expect everything to be fixed all at once. The important thing is that you're moving forward, even if it's just a little at a time." Henry looked at her, feeling a wave of gratitude. For so long, he had believed that he was doomed to live in isolation, burdened by the secret he carried. Now, with Emily by his side, he was starting to see that life could be different. Not perfect, not free from pain, but something more, something he had never allowed himself to imagine. The months continued to pass, and the bond between Henry and Emily deepened. They worked together every day, and as the days grew warmer, their connection became stronger. Emily had become not just a coworker, but a friend, a confidant, and maybe something more. There was a silent understanding between them, a connection that didn't need to be spoken. They both knew that, somehow, their lives were intertwined in a way that could never be undone. One evening, as they were walking through the town after work, Henry finally felt ready to open his heart fully. "Emily, I never thought I'd be able to say this, but..." He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. "I think I'm starting to forgive myself. And that's something I never thought was possible." Emily stopped walking beside him and turned to look at him. Her eyes were shining with a mix of surprise and tenderness. "I'm so glad to hear that, Henry." Her voice was full of emotion. "You deserve it. You deserve to be happy, to find peace." Henry nodded, feeling the weight of those words. For the first time, he believed them. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but now he wasn't walking it alone. With Emily by his side, he felt like he could face whatever challenges came his way. They continued walking in silence, their hands brushing lightly, but there was no need for words. There was a mutual understanding, a connection that went beyond conversation. The past, finally, was starting to fade behind them, and in front of them lay an uncertain future, but one full of possibilities. Later that night, as they stood outside Emily's house saying their goodbyes, Henry turned to her one last time before leaving. "I don't know what the future holds, Emily, but I want you to know, I'm grateful that you came into my life. For everything." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with the same hope Henry was beginning to feel. "I'm grateful too, Henry. So grateful." And with that, they said their goodbyes, knowing that, despite everything, what they shared was something new, something that could grow and strengthen over time. The past might continue to haunt them from time to time, but now, they were ready to face it together.